Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so our screencast for today is going to focus on foreign policy during time period number 6. And so really when we talked about this in class, we labeled this time period the era of imperialism, which is really kind of starting like in the 1880s all the way through like the early 1900s. So it kind of spans into time period 7 a little bit. So just be aware of that. Imperialism is not just in time period 6. It's really kind of spanning into time period 7 as well. So this is kind of a major kind of change in a lot of ways to our previous foreign policy. So you want to kind of think, again, always think continuity and change. What is different about this era of foreign policy in American history compared to earlier time periods in which we've studied? What are continuations? What are changes? What are continuations? So we're going to look at it through the lens of causes and effects to start off with. So when you look at kind of some of the major causes of what was behind pushing America to kind of get out there, and practice this ideology or actions of imperialism. Some of it's stemming from our competition with our European, European countries that are out there in the world at the time. So you have the British, and you have a lot of other Europeans are already carving up Africa. They're carving up China. They're carving up different parts of the world. And so America is kind of a little bit late behind some of these nations. And we do, to a certain extent, feel a little bit of pressure to kind of get out there and imperialize. Now, some of the military objectives behind imperialism is this concept known as Mahanism, and it's the kind of the ideology set out by a guy named Alfred T. Mahan, and he was a naval officer. And really his philosophy here is that America should kind of expand imperialistically around the world in order to gain strategic naval bases. Because he looks at Britain kind of as like a model as far as a major world power, and Britain utilizes its navy to dominate a lot of overseas markets and dominate different parts of the world. And so Mahan says that this is kind of a good strategy for extending American power and extending American influence. And part of his ideology is to not necessarily focus so much on conquering lots of land, but you want strategic places where you could place naval bases and have ports for refueling of military and economic ships. And essentially, that's kind of like Mahan's philosophy. So you kind of see this play out in a lot of cases in the Caribbean and also in the South Pacific for the United States. Okay, another philosophy kind of behind some of American imperialism is this racist philosophy of the white man's burden. So you see this with the Europeans, and this famous poem by Rudyard Kipling called The White Man's Burden is trying to urge America. So Kipling is a British subject, and he's trying to urge America to get involved in imperialism. And it's this concept that it is Europeans' duty, it's their burden to go out and civilize the rest of the world through imperialism. And so it's very much steeped in scientific racism and steeped in some of the social Darwinist philosophies of the time period. Now, America is also very much interested for economic reasons. And you might say in a lot of ways this is our principal reason for why we care and why we're interested in imperialism. America is going through this wave of industrialization, this massive wave of industrialization during the Gilded Age domestically. And so we're always kind of searching for overseas markets. And a lot of these potential places are great overseas markets in Latin America, in Asia with China and Japan. And so we're looking for additional places to sell our manufactured products, but also our agricultural products. Because remember, the South is still largely agrarian with cotton and tobacco. And so we're looking for places to kind of sell all of our different products around the world. So that's also driving our desire to go out and conquer land and to impose American life onto the people that we conquer. Now remember what imperialism is, right? We didn't really define it here in the beginning, but I think it's important to understand. So imperialism is not about just conquest of different places in the world. It's also about conquering those places and then trying to instill your ideas and your values onto the people that you conquer. In essence, in this case, you'll be trying to make those people like Americans in a lot of different ways. And it's pushing your language, it's pushing your religion, it's pushing your culture onto the people that you conquer. So one of the things that you want to kind of keep in mind, which I think is a great analysis tool for taking a look at imperialism, is do you see this as a continuation of earlier American philosophies like manifest destiny and the Monroe Doctrine, or do you see them as big departures, like, for example, maybe for departure from Washington's farewell address? How do you analyze this era of American history? Now, one of the big wars that kind of brings America into this imperialist mindset is the Spanish-American War. And so if you remember what's going on during the Spanish-American War, before the Spanish-American War, Cuba is still controlled by Spain. And there's Cuban revolutionaries who are trying to break away from the Spanish Empire in the mid to late 1890s. And essentially, America is going to capture the attention of the American public. A big part of it are the yellow journalist newspapers that are out there really kind of hyping up the situation that's happening in Cuba and really trying to gain the attention of Americans. And so you have William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer are running competing newspapers, and they're trying to get different readers through catchy headlines and different tactics. And so this embellishment, this expansion of the truth in order to kind of gain readers, this is known as yellow journalism, which is prevalent in this time period right before the Spanish-American War. Now, there's some other events that are kind of happening that are also pulling America close to the conflict. You have these reconcentration camps that the Spanish are running for Cuban revolutionaries, which are really, horrible human rights violations that the newspapers are covering. They're embellishing a little bit, but they're also covering them with just truth behind this. You have an explosion of a U.S. ship called the U.S. Maine, and this is destroyed outside of Cuba. At the time, all of the newspapers are speculating and saying, it was a bomb by the Spanish, a torpedo by the Spanish. Years later, they found out that it sank due to engine failure, and that was 100 years after the sinking of the Maine. And so these are kind of fueling the tension and causing America to potentially get involved in the Spanish-American War. Now, there's a lot of Americans that are very fearful of imperialism and anti-imperialist in the country. And so you have that pressure in Congress as well that America shouldn't become an imperialist nation. So before we actually declare war on Spain during this war, we're going to pass an amendment called the Teller Amendment, which essentially is an amendment to our war declaration declaring that we will not annex Cuba if we are victorious in the war. We're going to grant Cuba its independence. So it's trying to stem that tide of imperialism from an anti-imperialist mindset within the United States. Now, once the war ends, we're going to kind of backtrack on that in certain ways. And you see this kind of famous cartoon here. This cartoon is their perspective of imperialism is that essentially we've always been an expansionist country. We've always been some form of an imperialist country, and they're connecting imperialism to manifest destiny. So you have to see it. Do you think that connection makes sense? Is this a continuation of manifest destiny, or is this a departure? Are they different? Are they similar? And in what ways? And so after the Spanish-American War, what's going to happen is that the United States is going to gain some territory. So we gain Puerto Rico, we gain the Philippines, and we gain Guam. So we're kind of extending in two different directions. We're extending into the South Pacific, and we've purchased a lot of these islands and conquered some of these islands previously, and we're extending into Latin America, like specifically the Caribbean, but Latin America as well. And so these are our territorial gains from the Spanish-American War, but it kind of pushes America into a greater mindset of pushing for more dominance and influence over the Western Hemisphere, and more of an expansionist mentality. In addition to that, after the Spanish-American War, even though we agreed to not annex Cuba, we're also going to pressure Cuba to place in their constitution an amendment called the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment kind of appoints the United States as an intermediary for Cuba between Cuba and other powers around the world. And so it kind of gives America a lot of power over Cuba's foreign policy and how they interact internationally with different powers, that are potentially want to, trade or interact diplomatically with Cuba. So it's an interesting kind of foray. We do not give up these territories that we gain as a result of the Spanish-American War. And so it is, America kind of jumping into imperialism, specifically with the Philippines, as a really good example of America kind of becoming more involved in imperialism because they want their independence, and we fight a war to subjugate them and to keep the Philippines under American control. Now, part of the reason that we want to build the Panama Canal, so this happened under Teddy Roosevelt's administration. Part of the reason we want to build the Panama Canal is it connects our South Pacific Empire and our growing Caribbean Empire. And so, Teddy Roosevelt is able to kind of orchestrate this, and when we talked about it in class, we talked about how Panama was originally a part of Colombia, and they're going to have a revolution to break away from Colombia. And America does not directly get involved, but Teddy Roosevelt kind of makes it be known that America will stand to recognize this new Panamanian country, and hopefully in exchange we're going to get to build this canal, which eventually happens. And so this is a major economic benefit for the United States, because now it's easier to trade across both oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. It's also a major military victory, because now we have greater influence in different regions of the world. So now we're having influence in the South Pacific, the Caribbean, and we're extending our power as a nation. Now Roosevelt, partially to kind of enforce the idea of the Panama Canal, is going to issue a doctrine known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And why it's called the Roosevelt Corollary is it kind of builds off that previous doctrine of the Monroe Doctrine, issued by James Monroe in 1823. So the Roosevelt Corollary, this foreign policy idea, what it's going to institute is kind of make America more substantial power in the Western Hemisphere. So the Monroe Doctrine said to the Europeans, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. You can't colonize or recolonize these newly independent Latin American nations. As this cartoon suggests, the Roosevelt Corollary kind of self-anoints the United States as the policeman of the Western Hemisphere. So now we're kind of almost doing what we were doing with Cuba with the Platt Amendment for all of Latin American nations, whether they want it or they don't. And so it's kind of making America much more involved in Latin American countries' international relationships. And so now we are kind of like the principal police officer of the Western Hemisphere. So this is an interesting and definitely an interesting addition to the Monroe Doctrine. Whether you think it's a major change or you think it's just building off of it, that's again up for you to kind of analyze and to decide. Now, the next president in office, Taft, he's going to kind of build off of Roosevelt's idea of the Roosevelt Corollary and this idea that is known as the big stick policy. So Roosevelt's foreign policy is also known as the big stick policy, where he's willing to use the military to kind of threaten and kind of intimidate a lot of these different Latin American countries and European countries potentially in order to exercise this new policeman role. Taft, he's going to try and use something called dollar diplomacy. He's not going to really try to use the military as much as Roosevelt. His philosophy more is to try and use and influence these Latin American countries through investments and kind of using money as a way to kind of invest. And so there's interesting connections if you look at these different time periods between this time period and maybe a later time period we haven't gotten to study yet, like the Cold War, and methods of trying to influence different parts of the world. And are you going to use military means? Are you going to use economic means to try and influence different parts of the world? Okay, now the last thing we're just going to kind of take a look at is American foreign policy towards China. And so in the early 1900s, around the year 1900, America is going to propose this idea known as the open door policy to try and change the way that China trades with the world. Before this, the European powers had carved out what's called spheres of influence in China. And each European power, major European power, had a sphere of influence where they were able to have power over or economic exclusive trading rights in different parts of China. Now, the United States did not have a sphere of influence. So we're going to try and propose this idea of the open door policy to get China to trade openly with all powers around the world. We're hoping to our benefit so that we could grab some of this trade from China, which at the time is about 350 million people, which is a huge nation at the time. And so we attempt this. It never really comes to fruition because of events outside of America's control, like the Boxer Rebellion that breaks out in 1900. But it's important to understand that America is trying to extend into Asia, China. We are successfully able to open up Japan, earlier. And so America is trying to kind of extend its economic trading abilities throughout the world. And this is part of this era of imperialism. Okay, so we're going to wrap it there. And so remember, imperialism spans both time period 6 and into time period 7. When we pick up with our next lesson, we'll kind of continue with time period 7, the progressive era, and some other things that are happening in time period 7.